Morning. I'm going to circle around now and just talk specifically around water and try and raise the profile of water for all of you, and then just tell you that through some stories and some of the work we've done, and then circle back around and say, well, what does it mean for our rivers here in the garden route? Because of some work that we're hoping to do if we get funded. So just the very first thing, if I show you these two graphs, and I narrate it by saying we dropped 11 points and we dropped 21 points, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And these are the sort of banners that roll around our TVs every night, and lo and behold, it tends to be Dow Jones, or whoever she was, and the NASDAQ. And it seems to bring about this kind of response. And so what I'm looking for is how on earth we elevate this kind of reaction to old Mrs. Dow Jones and the NASDAQ. How do we do that for things that we've got indicators for and indices that matter to us, but that should matter more to society in general? And so that's part of my challenge to all of you, is maybe by the end of Thursday or mid-Thursday we can come up with a new index and we can get it rolling through our banners on the TV, and when we go into the airports, when people seem to look up and then clutch their heads. It's that move that I'm looking for. So we've got these two graphs that I showed you are the points that dropped in river health condition between about 10 years, and it was work that was done by Jean Nell and Mandy Driver, and for some reason hasn't brought about that response, the NASDAQ response. And they're really quite scary figures. Make sure I've got this is the worst one, Limpopo, but let's not rest on our laurels because we're not looking too good down in the Breede Gourits. We can also do this, because the health of our rivers is declining rapidly, and we are actually looking for responses that become more systemic within society. And what we've seen in our rivers, even though this is an oldish piece of work, it's over a decade old now, we have seen consistent non-compliance in the targets that we've set. And I just wanted to tell you some stories about why that happens and what we can do in the garden route rivers. Some of the things that we do, and again should have that same response, the NASDAQ response, let's rename it, is the fact that this is happening despite incredible indices that are coming around what our ecological infrastructure, water-related ecological infrastructure is worth. So 47 trillion is the value of our wetlands globally. These are more recent figures, 2019 figures. Okay, but we have also seen a massive decline in things like wetlands. These are really frightening figures, and I suppose part of it is a shock value, but we're talking about 2.2 billion people without access to good quality water, safe drinking water. And that's set to double by 2015, despite 2030, despite a whole lot of SDGs targets that we've set. And so I do think we need to be having the same responses we're having to the stock markets. Even this chap over here, took it upon himself to mention just what a crisis it is for people. It's a basic human right to have access to potable water, and it's something we're infringing upon. We're also seeing more and more work being done around the impacts of climate change and the threats to people's livelihoods. In fact, in The Lancet, in a fairly recent article, they talk about climate change and the health emergency. So just turning a little bit to South Africa now, also work done by the CSIR. This is critically endangered rivers, and I love this bit because everybody looks at where they live. Oh, look, I'm not doing so badly. But here we are in the garden route rivers down here, and our rivers are considered critically endangered, and where I used to work, a fairly similar pattern up in the Lowveld. You choose where you want to identify with. But again, things are not looking great. South Africa, more recent work that's come out since the CSIR work, the 2018 NBA. Again, they've highlighted in that the threat to rivers, 64% are threatened, wetlands, God, it's nearly 80%. I mean, surely if that was a stock market, we would be running for the door, all of us. Estuaries and wetlands are the most threatened and least protected of our ecosystems. What are some of the other indices we have? Blue drop. For people that don't know the blue drop, and I haven't got our NASDAQ man, but I've put up our previous minister because he really does need to be celebrated for the work that he did when he was in office. Sadly, we lost him to the Ministry of Police. But he got all of these things back on track. So the blue drop talks about the quality of water that's produced and then provided to people. And when we look at microbial compliance, we're looking at 62% non-compliance. If we're looking at chemical compliance, it's even worse. Excuse me. It's well over 2/3. And finally, we've got these figures back up here. If we look at it on a spatial scale, if we look at microbial non-compliance, red is obviously not great, it's terrible, and yellow is not great at all. Let's not get too complacent when we look in the garden route rivers, because if we look at chemical compliance, we're doing pretty badly. Okay, so these are very recent figures that have come out that should again have us all running for the natural asset stock market. In terms of green drop, which is the functioning of our wastewater treatment works, and I'm interested because a lot of people know about green drop, less about blue drop. We've seen that a decline, we've seen a decline again. 29% of all our wastewater treatment works, I think there were about 850 that were surveyed in 2013, and a decade later that's dropped to 39%. So down here, I know when I was sitting at the back, I couldn't see it, but the Western Cape, I always love the narrative that comes up around the Western Cape. It's always like, oh, well, we're doing so much better. There's quite a lot of rivers that I've been to in the Western Cape that really are being severely impacted by wastewater treatment works. For those of you that know Kloekieskraal, did I say that correctly? I mean, that's got direct sewage effluent going straight into one of the biggest wetlands in the Breda catchment from the wastewater treatment works. So again, there's our NASDAQ man in a state of disarray up there. Things are not looking great there. One of the things when we start looking at water security as a concept, and those of you that know me, I'm going to be very careful not to mention the word complexity, but water is complex and it is a complex system, is it raises the profile of a number of issues, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that. Things around climate change and flow, this lovely term ecological infrastructure, because apparently the layperson can't understand if it's not in kind of infrastructure and economic terms, but there we go. Human health, that is something we can understand. Equity, we heard about that this morning. I'm doing quite a lot of work on that, and environmental justice, and then collective action. Here's a different type of NASDAQ man, but there he is. This is some remarkable work that was done by Roland Schulze and Nick Davis. And what it shows is the impact, the projected impacts of climate change on stream flow. And in these very bright red-brown areas, we're talking about a 50 to 70% reduction in stream flow. What that means is if you've got 2 cubics going down a river, we're looking at about 1 cubic in the next 10 to 20 years. I mean, I'll talk about the ecological reserve, but the ability to meet the ecological reserve will be virtually impossible under that. The other thing it throws a lens onto is this issue of ecological apartheid. Unfortunately, in South Africa, that is a spatial distribution thing, people living in ex-homelands, disenfranchised people. Who's being impacted by this? You see a picture of a woman here trying to bathe in water just below acid mine drainage in Gauteng. And these are people collecting water in an area that I used to work in. You might be interested also in a new-ish report that's come out in the WRC that just shows how entrenched access to water is. And you can look that up. So these are structural issues, this issue of inequity. And in South Africa, it is largely a racial issue. I did some work. It's a new report that came out in the WRC where we started to look at leverage points, and health becomes a leverage point that many people can understand. And this just shows, this is for the Crocodile River in the eastern part of the country, the one that flows into Mozambique. Look at these figures here for arsenic. I mean, these risk values are absolutely frightening. This is above an acceptable level, okay? I'll tell you what arsenic does to you just now, aside from kill your mother-in-law. But we've got some other very nasty heavy metals, aluminium, ammonium, manganese, cyanide. I think it's cyanide you use on her. And then we've got cancer risks associated with that. It's a WRC report you can access. And this was some work where we were trying to make this more palatable to the board of the Nkomati Lesotho CMA. So just showing them. So once we said, oh, we're not compliant with targets, everybody was falling asleep. But as soon as we showed this and started saying, listen, if you don't do something about the quality of water, this is what you're looking at in vulnerable people. Nerve damage, cancer, lung, bladder, and so on and so forth. When it had an impact on prostates, quite a lot of people listened up. Okay. Measures to protect aquatic systems. What have we got in place? We've got the most incredible policies and legislation. We've got, I'm not going to go through the details, but we've got things called resource-directed measures, which are there to protect our water resources. And the targets that we develop are around the reserve, which I think most of you will have heard of, which is around flow and water quality, and then these resource quality objectives, which go into water use licenses. And we've got a catchment management strategy. So the strategy has a whole lot of things going on, but there's a big part of it is on water resource protection. But we have to implement all of this to deliver water resource protection. You don't just implement water resource protection. The ecological reserve and the basic human needs reserve have got targets now that are set for many, many of the rivers in South Africa. And so when I talk about compliance, I'm talking about compliance with those targets. I mean, we can't ask for anything better. And we're damn good in South Africa spending lots of money on determining that. This is some really old work that I did as part of the WRC project where we looked at non-compliance in the low-fault rivers with flow. So this is only flow, and it was pre and post the National Water Act, very roughly, and all the rivers except for the Sabi River were non-compliant in terms of flow. Do we have updated information on this? Is anybody tracking this? Only the Nkomati Lesotho Catchment Management Agency. So I can't give you updated figures. When we asked people why not, we looked at enabling conditions or constraints for this. There was some interesting stuff that came out around the reserve. What was most interesting for me was that even the regulator themselves, at that time was either the Proto-CMAs or Water Affairs, they didn't know what the reserve was, let alone know how to implement it. Lots of people said, oh, it's something for the Kruger. Mos, it's something for the Kruger, they want it. And very few people, probably 10% of the interviews, and I think we interviewed about 200 people, actually understood what it was. So that talks to not awareness raising, but a bunch of other things around co-learning. There was a lot of comments, and when I did the scoping phase up here in the Garden Route Rivers in preparation for a proposal, same thing came up. The regulator can't regulate. Monitoring and enforcement is extremely weak, and currently there are very few costs to being non-compliant. We do have a CME directorate. We lost Nigel Adams, who, bless him, he would at least fly in a helicopter and smack people over the wrist. And maybe that's what we need. This thing that I put up here for non-watery people is a flow duration curve. And this is what comes out of a reserve determination study. So this is what goes to people in the Proto-CMA. And they get told to implement it. Again, I think we were talking earlier this morning about, well, where's the mediation and the translation in this? And there have been very notable attempts to try and make this into something practical. Most importantly, and I can't stress this enough, is this idea of self-organization and peer watchdogging, if I can put it. Very quickly, I'm not sure if we've got time, but a quick anecdote. We were having problems with farmers in the Olifants River in the Lowveld, and they were stealing water. And eventually, my Afrikaans is appalling, so eventually I got Harry Biggs to come in, and partly because he looks kind of like a farmer, and I don't, and said, Harry, won't you just talk to them and tell them we kind of know they're stealing water? And then they said, yeah, get out the room. And there was a whole lot of shouting going on, you'll remember, Harry. And they called us in and they said, don't worry, we know who's stealing the water and we'll sort it out. So that internal peer learning and peer control is really important, and I think we must remember that. Trust has been built. Crocodile River in the Lowveld, amazing amount of trust has been built, even though people don't like the reserve. They've learned to trust the process because they understand it, and they've been given the task of implementing it, including the water user associations, which is mainly farmers. And so that gives us a reason for hope. So there you go, leadership, watchdogs. Kruger National Park played a key role. Sandparks here can do the same. This idea of self-organization and these multi-scale feedbacks, which I'm not going to go into now, but there's various papers on it. So how do we measure up here? This is the ecological condition, you know, our very own NASDAQ. And we look pretty good. You know, we're C, which is moderately modified. We can maintain basic ecosystem function as long as the catchments around them are not subjected to severe disturbances. So that's a key. If we compare it to Gauteng, I thought this might be interesting, much worse off. But overall, oh, by the way, these are draft outputs from the State of the Rivers, latest one, which still hasn't been released. But we have seen an alarming decrease or concerning decrease in deterioration across the country. These are national monitoring sites. Okay? If you go to the Kouka River, and where do we monitor river health? We've got one measly little site, and it's not doing very well. So this talks to the need for possibly citizen science, and it's one of the things I'm interested in getting going. Doing a whole lot better in what we know as Region K, these small rivers here in the garden route, but we know absolutely nothing about flow compliance. This only tells us about macroinvertebrate condition, and that tells us quite a lot about chemical conditions or water quality conditions. It tells us a little bit about flow, but we've got flows. We need to measure them and see if we're being compliant. All right, some positives. We've got finally under that wonderful Minister Mtunu, he got this thing going. It's been 25 years in the back room, to and fro around governance. We've now got 6 water management areas. It went down from 19 in the beginning. And we now have the Breda Olifants Catchment Management Agency. And they've been gazetted in April this year. In fact, all of them have been gazetted. So that's a really positive move that he did before he left office. We've got some other things on the go. I just thought I'd pop this up because Steph and Dirk and a whole group of you've also been looking into how do we mainstream this into sandparks. I think that's a really nice positive move. But we've got these amendments to the National Water Act, and they've got some implications for sustainability. It talks about securing strategic water source areas. I do worry about the rest of the catchment, but okay. They're revising how we do the reserve. They're revising water trading restrictions, and they're making water use associations responsible for ecological infrastructure, which in a way, in some ways, from an equity point of view, you can argue further embeds this power relationship, because a lot of the water user associations are still very powerful commercial white farmers. So any comments welcome on that process. All right, so what does all of this mean for the garden route rivers? Well, we've had a reserve determination, we've got our resource quality objectives, just go in and implement, is what we keep hearing and stakeholders keep saying. And my argument is let's do this based on experience and learning, some of the stuff I've shown. So just to show you, this is the staff for the Proto CMA, or now the CMA and Water Affairs, get from the reserve determination studies. Okay, they get told, okay, send down 0.15 of a cubic, and in the drought it must be that, and so on and so forth. And then they get told narratives and levels around water quality. I mean, how on earth do you take that to various sites, let's say maybe over 100 sites throughout the Garden Route rivers, and turn that into something meaningful on a daily basis? If flow is non-compliant today, we need to know why. We need to know, is it a farmer upstream that's stealing water? Have they just popped in their pump? And we need to be able to act on it now, not just a kind of generalized statement. So support is needed to help this poor woman actually do her job. So we're being told to implement the reserve, so staff don't know how to do it. Surprisingly, there's no procedures, there's no protocols to do this yet. We've got 5 new incoming CMAs, and they're being told to do this right away. The other important thing is if we're not compliant, and I had this experience at the Inkamati CMA, the board sat there, Marcus Salepi said, we're not compliant with the following water quality variables, and we're not compliant with flow. And the board practically fell asleep. So again, we need to translate that into something that has meaning for people, okay? And one of the ways of doing that, and that's the work we're doing at the moment, is looking at, well, what's the connection between that and human health? Because human health, as I said, has meaning for people. And we need very much this practice-based guidance around skills and competency, and most importantly, around meaning making. Next one. So, we've got a proposal in at the moment, which hopefully, anybody from WWF here? But, and a couple of other funders at the moment. But the idea here is to support collaborative action in the Breede Gerrits to implement, monitor, and report on freshwater biodiversity and social outcomes. Okay, we've learned that from history. Robin and I started this work earlier on, about 18 months ago, and we're hoping to build on it. And there are 3 objectives: capacity development, meaning making, that thing I was saying, yes, what does arsenic do to you? E. coli, what does that mean for you? And then the idea is to upscale some of that work and skills and competency into the other incoming CMAs, and building on the work that we did with the Inkamati Lesotho CMA. Two last things. Good, I'll be on time. I thought I'd let you know about some other work that we're doing on ecological infrastructure. This is really around water-related ecological infrastructure, and it's really heartening to see this has flowed down from, it's funny, sometimes people go, oh, I'm so bored by policy. But actually, this is the signing of COP and various other international agreements that's flowed down in South Africa into the municipalities. And the municipalities are now taking on this idea of ecological infrastructure in conjunction with built infrastructure. And that's been happening. I did some work in the Umbombela area, which is former Nelspruit in the Crocodile River, working at the moment on the Berg River Drakenstein municipality, which is this identification for flood alleviation, and it's a hybrid approach. And then what came out of the Ecological Infrastructure for Water Security project, it's quite a mouthful, but they've got 2 project sites, one's in the Breede and the other one's in the Umgeni, and as the FRC we're working in the Breede, looking at an ecological infrastructure management plan. Okay, one last thing, just please everyone keep an eye on how these targets are narrated. I did a quick review of the latest Garden Route IDP. They spoke about water security. There was no mention of resource-directed measures, of these water quality targets, of the reserve, nothing, absolutely nothing. And that is in a meaningful way, is to look at how we embed this in other plans and projects. So, how do we raise the profile of ecosystem health? Well, let's find our own index that is not the stock market. And there you go. I thought of a couple of them. It was like river health index, the RIHI. That doesn't sound so good. So maybe there's my challenge to everybody. Let's come up with something around aquatic health, maybe it's Aqui-Indi, that we can see emblazoned across also our news programs. Thanks.